I was listening with very great interest to a recent book review broadcast by Kenneth Rexroth on KPFA, in which he was discussing a recent book of poems by the San Francisco poet Philip Lamantia. And he was pointing out how the poems were of a decidedly ecstatic character, and was making a number of very interesting observations upon what might almost be called a cult of ecstasy. A cult of ecstasy expressing itself in the current interest in unusual states of consciousness, whether they be the result of mysticism or of drugs or of anything of this kind. And he was saying that you have to make a very clear distinction indeed between ecstasy and sanctity. I'm not quite sure that this is the happiest pair of opposites one could produce, because after all, sanctity has special overtones of a person who has perfected himself in a certain morality or rule of life. And perhaps it didn't originally mean that. Holy, for example, does not originally mean good. Holy means whole, complete. And thus, you might say, God is not holy unless God also somehow includes the devil, which is, as it were, the other face of God. But I think it's terribly important to understand that if you're interested in Eastern philosophy, if you're studying Hinduism or Buddhism or something of that kind, with the object of attaining ecstasy, at this point Kenneth Rexroth was perfectly right in saying that this is a complete misunderstanding. He was also saying that he was making a kind of contrast of beat and square. He was saying how all the New York and San Francisco beat people are just fascinated with ecstasy, but that on the contrary, genuine mysticism is much more likely to be found among humble and devoted adherents of such great traditions as Roman Catholicism, or perhaps Buddhism or Hinduism, as it's actually practiced in Asia. Because these are not people looking for ecstasy, they're people simply devotedly following a way of life which is often very hard indeed. And he was, of course, particularly irate about the people who think that they can get anything of this kind by taking certain drugs, and even went so far as to call Aldous Huxley the Los Angeles idiot. Well, I think that's really very unfair, because it should be said that although ecstasy will not of itself, however induced, produce creative activity, whether it be moral or whether it be artistic, it won't do it for you. But if a person has a great deal of intelligence or artistic ability anyhow, then an ecstatic experience may give him something to express. After all, if I'm incapable of describing things, if I were so poor a writer that I couldn't even describe a cloud, I shouldn't be able to communicate much as a result of having had some ecstasy. But on the other hand, if a person can communicate, and Aldous Huxley is an absolutely superb writer, then as a result of having an ecstasy, he's got something to say. And after all, this is actually a man of very great intelligence and learning. And the point is not at all that one could somehow transform a sow's ear into a silk purse with a dose of mescaline, but that certain experiences of this kind might be valuable to people able to profit from them. But this is not the main point. The main point that I think is of great importance here is that there must be a distinction between ecstasy, that is to say, the thrill, the kick, the delight, the joy of a mystical experience, and the experience itself. Because the experience itself may or may not have ecstasy as a consequence. That is simply a byproduct. The experience itself is always a matter of insight. And the insight, the understanding of the way things are, what you are, what life is, may indeed produce ecstasy, because sometimes this understanding is an enormous relief. And that is the reason when one has been battling, say, with some tremendous problem and suddenly finds the whole thing disappears, when you've been terrified at something or anxious about something and all the grounds for anxiety vanish, then very naturally you feel enormously happy and joyous. And also, I would add that the kind of insight which is the essence or the core of this sort of experience has a way of making the ordinary everyday world seem extraordinarily beautiful. And that again is a byproduct. Whereas things before seemed rather dim and oppressive. You know how even on a fine day, if you're feeling sad or depressed, the actual landscape somehow looks dimmer. Whereas on the other hand, if you're feeling wonderful, the landscape itself looks wonderful. And so in the same way, if one has had certain insights which bring about an extraordinary sense of relief from the oppression of certain problems, then very naturally everything in the world looks a lot better. Even go so far as to say it seems transfused with a divine light. Before saying anything about the nature of insight, to point out that I've long been convinced that mystical experience, that is to say, when it doesn't involve visions, when it doesn't involve seeing Jesus or the Buddha or Krishna or something of this kind, when we have what I would call a non-imagistic type of experience, it's pretty much the same thing all over the world and in whatever tradition it happens to arise. But because it is an extraordinarily difficult thing to describe, people use images and figures of speech which lie ready to them. A person who is a believer in God will almost inevitably draw in his idea of God to interpret this experience. Whereas, on the other hand, a person who is not a believer in God will not use that way of describing it. And the types of description, the imagery used, is so diverse that very naturally students of comparative religion and comparative mysticism are sometimes led to believe that there are completely different kinds of insight. And that, for example, the nirvana experience of a Buddhist is something totally different in its epistemological or psychological character from the Christian's vision of God. But I don't think that this necessarily follows at all. And perhaps we can see why if we go back to the subject of the original insight itself and try to see wherein that consists, and we shall see not only how it differs from ecstasy, but also how it could be understood as being the same thing that underlies types of mystical experience that are expressed in very different sorts of imagery. Speaking first of all from, say, a Buddhist standpoint, there's no doubt in my mind that the insight in question that constitutes what is called Satori in Zen,